My son placed a first-class ticket on the counter and smiled. "Dad, you've been carrying too much. 10 days just for you." He drove me to the airport, held me at the door, and whispered, "Call me when you land. I'll be right here." Then he turned and left, without a backward glance. As far as he was concerned, I was already 30,000 feet up. He had it wrong. I never set foot on that plane. Instead, I called a car and handed the driver an address my son had no idea even existed. Welcome back to Calm Family Revenge, a place where real family stories are told with honesty and care. If this is your first time here, I am glad you found your way. Consider following along so you never miss a story like this one. Before we go further, I want to ask you something simple. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting yourself from someone you loved? Drop your answer in the comments. I read everyone. One more thing before we begin: some details in this story have been shaped for storytelling purposes, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters most is the message it carries. My name is Eugene Calloway. This narrative incorporates stylized elements for educational and creative purposes. Any resemblance to specific names or locations is incidental, but the core message is highly valuable for you. 68 years old, and before I get to what unfolded that Tuesday morning in May, there is a woman you need to know about first. Her name was Helen. Spring of 1980, a small architecture firm in Escondido, California. That is where we found each other. I was barely into my second week as a junior draftsman. She was already the sharpest mind in the office. The way she moved through a set of blueprints reminded me of someone reading verse, unhurried, precise, each line treated as though it carried genuine weight. A set of structural drawings for a parking garage. That is what did it for me. Not exactly the stuff of romance novels, but it was genuine, and it held for 41 years. Building a life with Helen was like building anything worth building, deliberately, patiently, always asking what would still be standing once the temporary supports were pulled away. We closed on the Pelican Bay house in 1997, a two-story craftsman with cedar shake roof, forest green shutters, and a wraparound back porch that pulled in the ocean air every evening from April through September. Helen picked the shutters. I picked the tile. 3 weeks of bickering over kitchen countertops, and then 18 years of smiling every time we walked past them. Pancreatic cancer came for her in the winter of 2014. She was gone by the following October. I won't linger on those months. There are things that belong to a person and not to a story. What I can say is that Helen moved through it exactly as she moved through everything else, clear-eyed, composed, and more practical about it than I ever could have been. About 2 weeks before the end, she summoned me to the bedroom, held my hand in both of hers, and laid out precisely what she wanted for the trust fund she had grown over 30 years from her family's inheritance. "The house stays in your name," she told me. Her voice had grown fragile by then, but her gaze had not. "Don't let anyone talk you into anything different, and take care of Dorian." I gave her my word on both counts. I held one of them. Dorian was 30 when his mother passed. He came in from Seattle, where his second venture, a tech consulting firm he'd launched with a college friend, was losing ground quietly. He kept vigil at her bedside for those last 4 days. Whatever I came to know later, I will always give him that. He was present at the end, and Helen left this world with her son's hand wrapped around hers. That is something I have to keep. Something I need to believe carried real weight. He stayed in Pelican Bay for 3 weeks after we buried her back in his childhood room, working through the stream of casseroles the neighbors kept delivering. When he finally drove away, he pulled me into a hug in the driveway. "I'll be okay, Dad. Don't worry about me." I worried anyway. It was simply who I was. Helen used to compare it to the way other men keep a wallet, my concern for people always on my person, ready to surface at the smallest prompt. 18 months on the consulting firm in Seattle officially shut its doors. Dorian rang me on a Sunday evening, his voice measured and rehearsed, in the way of a man who has run through a conversation several times before picking up the phone. Real estate, he said. Connections throughout San Diego County. A solid plan. All he was short on was the money to start. The following Wednesday, I transferred $400,000 out of the trust fund. Third time I had backed one of Dorian's ideas. Before this, there had been a restaurant in North Park that ran 14 months before collapsing. Before that, an event planning outfit in San Diego that never really got off the ground. Each time he'd shown up with the same measured voice, the same practiced certainty. And each time I had written the check before asking the right questions. Helen would have asked them. That absence was one of the 10,000 things I felt every day she was gone. Callaway Property Group opened in La Jolla in the spring of 2018, and from the outside, it had every mark of a real operation. Dorian leased space on Girard Avenue, brought on 2 junior agents, and built a client list that grew steadily through that first year. He relocated back to San Diego County and moved into the Pelican Bay house temporarily, he said, just while the business found solid ground. Month 7 came and went, and temporary had quietly become permanent, and I told myself it didn't matter. The house was too large for one person. Having him across the breakfast table each morning felt like something Helen would have been glad of. I had grown practiced at framing my choices that way, by what she might have sanctioned, which was probably not the wisest compass to navigate by, but it was the only one I had. 2 years passed in a comfortable rhythm. Coffee at 6:30, Dorian out by 8, dinner shared 3 or 4 evenings a week. Him talking through listings, clients, the particular pressures of selling luxury property along the coast. Me listening, asking the occasional question, and feeling more than I liked to acknowledge, like someone observing a life that had once been his from a slight but growing distance. It wasn't miserable. That much I can say honestly. But it wasn't fully truthful either, and 2 things are not as far apart as they might seem. Then, one Tuesday morning in March, I came downstairs to put the coffee on, and something stopped me at the kitchen threshold. A scent, soft but unmistakable sweet, with a floral note underneath one that had no right to be there. Not Helen's. Helen had worn the same fragrance for 30 years, a clean sandalwood scent she ordered from a small company in Maine. The ghost of it still drifted through certain corners of the house, the way the past tends to linger when you've stopped fighting it. This was different. Younger, sharper, and entirely out of place in my kitchen at 6:15 in the morning when Dorian was supposed to have spent the evening home alone. I poured my coffee and stood at the counter and kept my mouth shut. 40 years of reading blueprints had taught me one thing above all others. I could recognize when something wasn't sound. So I said nothing about the scent that morning. Just filled my mug, settled onto the kitchen island stool, the same spot where Helen and I used to work through the Sunday paper together, and drank slowly while Dorian came down the stairs in his office clothes, fixing his tie, reaching across me for the coffee pot, with the unhurried ease of a man who has never once questioned whether he belongs somewhere. "Morning, Dad," he said, eyes on his mug. "Morning," I said. Before the coffee was even done brewing, he had his phone out twice. Each time he tilted the screen toward himself, in a move so smoothed out, it had stopped registering to him as a choice, the way a long-practiced deception eventually loses the texture of deception and becomes just habit. I clocked it both times. Said nothing either time. That morning marked the opening of what I can only call a second education. My first had been architecture, The discipline of looking past surfaces to read the underlying logic of a structure, the push and pull of load and support the way every joint and beam tells you something true about the whole. This one was slower and cut deeper. It was the education of loving someone and being forced gradually and against your will to see them without the shelter of what you had assumed. 4 days later, the scent was back. This time it met me in the upstairs hallway outside Dorian's room, a faint thread of sweetness seeping from beneath his door as I passed at 7 o'clock in the morning. He'd told me the evening before that he had an early showing in Del Mar and would be gone before 6 o'clock. His car was indeed missing, but the perfume had stayed behind, hanging in the corridor with the quiet stubbornness of something that had been given time to settle. I stopped walking, pressed one hand against the wall, and felt a tightness move through my chest. Not anger, not quite yet. Something colder. The first faint signal that the things I had chosen to believe might not hold. The following Tuesday, I had a medical appointment in La Jolla and made it home a full 2 hours ahead of schedule without having mentioned to Dorian that I might. His SUV sat in the driveway. Next to it, angled in with the ease of a car that knew the spot, was a bright red Mini Cooper I had never laid eyes on. By the time I pushed through the front door, it had gone. I hadn't even been in the driveway 4 full minutes. Dorian pulled the front door open before my hand reached the key. His face was composed, unreadable, only his collar gave anything away, creased in a way that had nothing to do with a morning of property showings. "You're back early," he said. Casual, unburdened, precisely the tone of a man with no reason to explain himself. "Appointment wrapped up faster than expected," I said. "How'd the morning go?" Fine, I said. "Everything's fine." I moved past him, hung my jacket at the door, kept my hands from betraying me, and did not look back. I thought about Helen and what she would have done in my place. She would have asked directly. The question would have been out of her mouth before she had finished forming it, because she had never feared the answer the way I did. That particular kind of courage was something she carried naturally, and I had spent years learning just how wide that gap between us was. 3 weeks went by. The red Mini Cooper didn't reappear, not that I could see, but other things persisted. Dorian's phone always faced down at the dinner table. His answers to my questions about his week growing thinner and more polished, losing the small, unrepeatable texture that separates genuine conversation from a well-rehearsed performance. The scent in the house, faint but recurring like a word hovering just past the edge of recall. Then came the name. I was in the living room one evening, a book open in my lap, when Dorian's phone buzzed on the coffee table between us. He snatched it up immediately, the reaching of someone who had been expecting exactly that moment, but a half-second too slow. The screen held for 2 full seconds before his palm came down. Long enough. One word. Brienne. Dorian carried the phone into the kitchen, something about a client murmured under his breath. A laugh reached me from the other room, quiet, private, entirely unlike the one he used across from me at dinner. It went on about 4 minutes. When he came back, he placed the phone face down as always and picked up the television remote. "Client emergency?" I asked. "Something like that," he said, and flipped the channel. I turned back to my book and absorbed nothing from it. My mind had already gone somewhere else, back to the place I always returned to: blueprint structure, the discipline of reading a building for what it actually was, rather than what its facade suggested. Laid out beneath the surface of those 3 weeks, plainly and soberly, was a system under real strain. Not the kind that announces itself in a sudden break. The kind that fails quietly in the hidden joints where no one thinks to look. I closed my book, set it on the side table, and told myself I was seeing things that weren't there. I was mistaken. 2 weeks before everything broke open, Dorian made the error that people who have grown too comfortable with their own impunity eventually make. He walked away from his laptop with it open on the sofa. Saturday afternoon, early April. The marine layer had settled in off the Pacific, the way it does on most spring mornings in Pelican Bay, softening everything to a dim, quiet gray. Dorian had been at the coffee table since breakfast, laptop open, papers scattered in the organized disorder of a man demonstrating effort. Around 2 o'clock, his phone rang. He pushed back from the table, headed for the back porch, and drew the glass door closed behind him. I was on my way from the kitchen to the hallway when the glow of the screen caught me. I nearly kept moving. I want to say that plainly. There was a version of that afternoon where I kept my eyes ahead, went upstairs, settled into the chair by the window, and went on being who I had been for the previous 3 weeks, watchful, quiet, extending the benefit of the doubt for as long as it would stretch. That version had about 2 steps left in it. Then the screen brightened with a new message, and I stopped. The application was open to a conversation thread. The name at the top read Brianne. The newest message had just arrived, its text there in the unguarded openness of an unlocked screen in a room with no one watching. I read it, then read it again. Then I began scrolling back through the messages above it carefully, with one finger, the way I used to work through structural assessments on buildings I suspected had been compromised, methodical, unflinching tracking, back to find the exact point where things had gone wrong. Here is what I found. Brianne had written, "Baby, I cannot wait to see the house." Dorian had replied, "Soon. I just need to get him out of the way first. 10 days should be more than enough." Brianne, "Are you sure he won't figure it out?" Dorian, positive. "He trusts me completely. I'll book him something nice somewhere far. He'll be grateful. He's always grateful." Brianne, "You're terrible, you know that." I stood in the living room of the house Helen and I had built together, one finger resting on my son's trackpad, and I read those words until they shed their meaning as words and became something else. A blueprint clear and damning of a structure I was never supposed to see. He planned to send me away. 10 days. He had already been in contact with someone about the trust, my trust, Helen's trust. The thing she had spent 30 years constructing and pressed into my hands with her last clear breath, and Dorian had reduced it to something complicated, as if the moral gravity of what he was arranging were nothing more than a scheduling problem. I straightened, lifted my finger from the trackpad. The screen dimmed, then went black. Outside on the porch, Dorian was still talking, voice blurred by the glass, one hand tracing shapes in the air, the way it did when he was making a point he believed in. He had his mother's hands, long fingers, expressive, always in motion. Seeing them through that window in that moment brought a grief so sudden and so precise that it knocked the breath from me for a second. Not grief for what I had just read. Grief for what it told me about all the years that had led here. Every breakfast, every dinner, every Sunday evening call delivered in that careful, practiced voice. I walked to the hallway, went upstairs, pulled my bedroom door shut, and sat in the chair by the window that faced out over the valley and the far glint of the Pacific. My hands rested together in my lap. They were still. That surprised me, the steadiness of them, as though my body had already made a decision without asking my permission, and the decision was this: not the time to come undone. Now was the time to think. I stayed in that chair a long while. The marine layer had started lifting by the time I heard Dorian return inside the glass door below, sliding open and shut, his footsteps crossing the floor beneath me. He called up the stairs. "Dad, you want coffee?" Easy, warm, the voice of a man with no inkling that the ground under his feet had shifted for good. "Not right now," I called back. My voice came out even. I was grateful for that. I waited until I heard him settle back at the coffee table. Then I found the name in my phone I needed and pressed call. Philip answered on the second ring. Philip Calloway is 3 years my senior. He has spent the past 22 years in San Diego in a house 2 blocks from the water that he shares with 2 golden retrievers named Biscuit and Remy, and a woodworking shop he put together in the garage after retiring from teaching. He is the sort of person who picks up on the second ring, not because he has nothing else going on, but because when someone he cares about calls, he decides right then to be present for them. Eugene, he said. Just my name. The way he said it told me he already sensed something was wrong. I need to tell you something, I said, and I need you to let me get through all of it before you say anything. All right, he said. I'm listening. I told him everything. The perfume the phone always face, down the red Mini Cooper, vanishing from the driveway. The name Brienne on the screen, and then the laptop, the thread, the words, the 10 days, the trust. I recited the messages from memory because I had read them enough times that afternoon to have them cut into me the way certain things do when you understand they are going to alter everything. Philip was quiet when I finished. Not the silence of someone searching for the right words, the silence of someone who has them ready and is thinking about how to offer them gently. Eugene, he said at last. I tried to tell you this 3 years ago, and once before that. The words arrived without any edge to them. That was Philip. He had never in his life used a hard truth as something to strike with. I know, I said. You told me I was jealous of your relationship with him. After the second time, I decided you needed to see it for yourself. He paused. I hated being right about this. I want you to know that. Something closed in my throat in a way I hadn't anticipated. 68 years old, alone in a dark bedroom, and the sound of my older brother's voice on the phone reduced me to something closer to 17. Not helpless, but young enough to still believe that sharing the weight of a truth made it easier to carry. What do I do? I asked. Philip didn't pause. Call Renata Voss tonight. Don't wait until morning. Renata Voss had been my attorney for 15 years, precise, relentless, the kind of lawyer who had managed Helen's estate with a care that went well beyond professional obligation, and who had told me things I did not want to hear on more than one occasion, always with the same level composure of someone who knew that a hard truth delivered cleanly does less damage than a comfortable lie left to fester. I had her number by heart. I had never dialed it at 8 o'clock on a Saturday evening. She picked up on the third ring. Eugene. Her tone shifted at once from easy to alert, the way a surgeon's whole bearing changes the moment they cross into the operating room. What's happened? I told her. More condensed this time, stripped to the essential facts in the order they mattered, the way she had always asked me to present things. When I finished, she asked 2 questions. Whether Dorian knew I'd seen the laptop. Whether I had disturbed anything or moved anything in the house. No, I said. And no. Good, she said. A brief silence followed, the kind that signals thinking, not uncertainty. Eugene, I need you to do something very difficult. I need you to go downstairs tomorrow morning, make breakfast, and carry on as though nothing has changed. Can you do that? I looked toward my bedroom door, beyond which my son was presumably stretched out on the sofa, watching television or working through his phone, completely unaware that the structure of everything he had been building had just been laid open to the one person he had counted on to stay in the dark. Yes, I said. I can do that. Don't say a word to him, Renata said. Not one. I'll reach out Monday with next steps. And Eugene, I need you to trust me completely on timing of this. Do you understand? I understand, I said. After the call ended, I stayed in the dark for a few more minutes. Downstairs, I could make out the low murmur of the television. Some sports broadcast the cadence of commentary lifting and falling. My son at ease in the home I had built, mapping out a future using my money entirely confident in my blindness. I rose and went to the window, looked out at the valley. The lights of Pelican Bay lay below in their quiet, measured rows, and beyond them the Pacific moved in the darkness, invisible but present, vast and unhurried and unmoved by the small disasters of men. I thought about Helen, about what she had asked of me from that hospital bed, the pressure of her hands on mine, the clarity still in her eyes at the very end. So take care of Dorian. I had tried. 8 years I had tried. But there was something she had not said, something I could only understand now standing at that window in the dark, which was that taking care of someone and needing to protect yourself from them were not always the same thing. Renata called me Monday morning at 8:45, which told me she had already been working since Saturday night. I've been thinking through how to approach this. She said no greeting the way she always operated when a problem had claimed her complete focus. And I want to bring in someone I trust. His name is Garrett Finch. He's a licensed private investigator out of Carlsbad, 18 years in San Diego County, mostly family law and asset cases. He's careful, discreet, and he doesn't make mistakes. What will he do? I asked. External surveillance, Renata said. Nothing inside your home, nothing that touches your property. Public places, parking areas, restaurants. He'll document what Dorian does when you're not present, who he's with, where they go, what accounts are used to pay for it. If Dorian has been drawing on trust funds for this woman, Garrett will find the paper trail. I thought of the red Mini Cooper, the way it had come and gone from my driveway, like a suspicion I couldn't get my hands around. How long? I asked. 3 weeks, she said. Maybe less if Dorian is as careless as he appears to be. Garrett Finch turned out to be a trim, quiet man in his late 40s who dressed in clothes that drew no attention and drove a gray sedan so deliberately ordinary it seemed engineered to disappear. He came to Renata's office on a Tuesday afternoon, shook my hand, brief, firm, and asked me 3 precise questions. Dorian's daily routine, his vehicle, and the name of the woman on the laptop. He wrote the answers in a small notebook and said he'd be in touch. Over the following 3 weeks, Garrett assembled a case that Dorian had been building carelessly for months. He photographed Dorian and Brianne Coulter at dinner at Costera in La Jolla on a Thursday evening, a meal totaling $412 charged to a credit card tied to the Calloway family account. He documented Brianne's red Mini Cooper parked outside my home on 4 separate occasions between 9 o'clock in the morning and 2 o'clock in the afternoon on days when I had mentioned to Dorian that I'd be at medical appointments or out running errands. He pulled GPS records, placing the Mini Cooper on our street, repeatedly going back 11 weeks. He uncovered a hotel reservation in Del Mar, 2 nights charged again to the family account made 6 weeks earlier under Dorian's name. Every report reached Renata's secure inbox within hours of the event. She called me after each one, her voice growing quieter and more precise each time, which was how I had learned to read her when she was becoming very serious indeed. Meanwhile, every morning I went downstairs and made breakfast. I want you to understand what those 3 weeks actually cost me, because to describe it as mere patience would be dishonest. Each morning, I sat across the kitchen island from my son and asked him how he'd slept and whether he wanted eggs, and he answered with the easy warmth of someone who believed himself perfectly safe. And I smiled and slid the coffee toward him and felt the gap between what I carried and what I showed stretching wider with every passing hour. There was one particular morning, a Thursday, about halfway through the 3rd week, when Dorian glanced up from his phone and said, "You seem good lately, Dad. Relaxed." He was smiling, and I could tell he meant it, and in that moment I understood the specific cruelty of his obliviousness. He had read my stillness as contentment. He had looked at my surface and found exactly what suited him, and it had not crossed his mind, not even for a moment, that a surface might not be the whole structure. I feel good, I told him. I've been sleeping better. He nodded, satisfied, and turned back to his phone. That was the morning something Renata had said at the very start finally moved from my head into my bones. She had told me, "Eugene, we need you to go in yourself. Garrett's evidence is strong, but your testimony as the homeowner, your voice, your presence, your words on a recording, made inside your own property combined with everything Garrett has gathered externally, creates something no attorney can challenge. One without the other is manageable. Together, they're airtight." She had also set something up that I didn't fully grasp until she'd walked me through it twice. Every photograph and audio recording I made on my phone would automatically sync to a secured server at her firm within 3 seconds of being captured. The technology was simple enough, a backup application connected to an encrypted cloud account, accessible only through Renata's office. The practical meaning was this: even if Dorian took my phone from my hands, the instant I used it, the evidence would already be beyond his reach. "There's nothing he can do to undo it," Renata told me. "Once you press the button, it's done." By the close of the 3rd week, Renata rang me on a Friday evening and said the 4 words I had been waiting for. "We're ready," she said, "whenever you are." I was sitting at the kitchen table when the call came, looking at the fruit bowl Helen had found at a market in Escondido in 2002. A heavy ceramic thing painted with peonies and trailing vines that had sat in the same spot on the same table for over 20 years. Dorian came in behind me, checked the refrigerator, and asked if we were out of orange juice. "I think so," I said. "I'll pick some up tomorrow." "No worries," he said, easy and bright, and walked back out. I looked at the fruit bowl a moment longer. Then I looked at my phone. Then one morning, Dorian came downstairs with a brochure in his hand and a smile I had never quite trusted. The brochure was glossy and thick, the kind of promotional piece that costs more to print than most people spend on a night out. Dorian placed it on the kitchen island in front of me with the deliberate care of a man presenting proof of his own generosity, and I looked down at it without picking it up. Mauna Lani Resort, Big Island, Hawaii. The cover showed an infinity pool dissolving into an open ocean horizon, every color pushed to the edge of believability. Beside the brochure sat a white envelope, and inside that envelope I already knew there was a plane ticket, first class, non-refundable. "Dad!" Dorian said, his voice carrying the particular warmth he reached for when he wanted something full and unhurried built to fill whatever room he was in. "You've been carrying a lot lately. I can see it on you. You need to get away from all of this for a while." I picked up the brochure. I turned it over in my hands at a measured pace, giving him the performance he had come down expecting. The older man moved by his son's thoughtfulness. The father softened by evidence of care. The pool on the cover gleamed. The palm trees were immaculately arranged. The whole thing had been engineered to look like paradise, and every inch of it was a lie. 10 days. Dorian continued settling against the counter with his arms folded, watching me with the steady patience of someone who has already determined how a conversation ends. All-inclusive private suite, beachside, the whole package. "You can just rest, Dad. No responsibilities, no schedule, just you." I opened the envelope and drew out the ticket. "Eugene Callaway, Honolulu, Hawaii. Departing tomorrow morning, 6:45 first class. Non-refundable, as expected." "This is very thoughtful, son," I said. The relief that crossed Dorian's face was so swift and so total, it almost passed for love. His shoulders fell half an inch. The set of his jaw loosened. He reached for his coffee mug and smiled into it, and I saw clearly what satisfaction looked like on a man who had just confirmed his plan was on track. "You deserve it," he said. "You really do." I folded the ticket back into the envelope and set it down beside my coffee. My hands were steady. My expression was composed. Something turned over quietly inside my chest, the way a page turns in a very old book. That evening, I brought my suitcase down from the top shelf of the bedroom closet, the large one navy blue that Helen and I had bought for a trip to Greece we took in 2008. Dust had settled in the creases along the zipper. I ran the back of my hand across it and set the case open on the bed. Then I started packing. Not the linen shirts Dorian had mentioned, not the swimming shorts, not the resort sandals arranged along the closet floor. Instead, I folded a pair of dark jeans and laid them flat at the bottom. A charcoal turtleneck, a gray Henley, a lightweight jacket in navy that didn't catch the light. Running shoes, dark, sole, low profile. Clothes that made no announcement. Built for movement and intention, not for poolside leisure. When the suitcase was packed, I zipped it and sat on the edge of the bed looking at it. Helen's photograph watched me from the nightstand. A candid Philip had taken at a birthday party in 1996. Her head thrown back, mid-laugh, eyes bright and entirely unguarded. It was the most truthful picture anyone had ever taken of her. I reached out and rested my fingers on the edge of the frame. "I promised you I'd take care of him," I said quietly. "I kept that promise for 8 years. But you also showed me that the people who love us well don't ask us to vanish, so someone else can take what we built." I turned off the bedside lamp. Downstairs, I could hear Dorian on the phone, his voice low and satisfied, moving through the house with the ease of a man who had already decided how tomorrow would go. In a way, he was right. Tomorrow was decided, just not in the way he imagined. Dorian was up before me. I came downstairs at 5:45 to find him already dressed, already caffeinated, moving through the kitchen on the low-grade energy of a man who hadn't slept particularly well, but was too pleased with himself to let it show. He had brewed a full pot of coffee, not just enough for one, and set a travel mug on the counter, with the lid already off, the way Helen used to do when I had an early flight. That detail landed somewhere behind my sternum. I didn't let it show. "Big day," Dorian said, grinning as he passed me the mug. His eyes had the brightness of someone running on anticipation rather than sleep. "You ready?" "Almost," I said. I poured the coffee, added a little cream, and took the first sip standing at the counter while Dorian loaded my suitcase into the back of his SUV. Through the kitchen window, I watched him hoist it close the trunk with a solid thunk and brush his hands together with the satisfied air of a man finishing a job that needed doing. The dark jeans and turtleneck folded inside that bag would have baffled him completely. I was glad he couldn't see them. The drive to San Diego International Airport took 40 minutes in the early morning quiet. The freeways still light the sky above San Diego County, easing from deep blue into the pale amber of a coastal California dawn. Dorian drove with one hand on the wheel and filled the silence with talk. A property he was hoping to list in Torrey Pines, a client who kept revising his ideas about square footage, a restaurant in Coronado he thought I ought to try when I returned. His voice moved through the car with the practiced ease of a man who had rehearsed being normal so thoroughly he no longer registered doing it. I watched the landscape shift past my window eucalyptus trees, along the boulevard orderly rooftops catching the first light, a brief blue flash of the Pacific between hills that was gone before the freeway finished its curve. "You're quiet," Dorian said at one point, glancing over. "Early morning," I told him. He nodded, content with that, and kept talking. San Diego International Airport appeared ahead of us, its familiar lines steady in the morning light. A clean, efficient airport that had always struck me as an honest reflection of the region, functional, well-kept, and quietly self-assured. Dorian pulled into the departure lane with the unhurried ease of someone with nothing pressing, and found a spot near the entrance without difficulty, as though the morning itself had arranged things to oblige him. He insisted on carrying the suitcase. Of course he did. We walked to the entrance together, the case rolling smoothly on the pavement, and Dorian held the door and let me through first, then set the bag upright beside the check-in counters, with a small flourish like a bellman finishing a delivery. The terminal was filling with the particular energy of an early morning at a regional airport rolling luggage coffee cups, the muffled echo of departure announcements moving through the open space. Dorian turned to face me. His expression had shifted into something gentler, something that in a different life I might have trusted without reservation. He opened his arms and drew me into a hug, firm, warm, held a beat longer than it needed to be, the kind built to feel meaningful. "Call me when you land," he said close to my shoulder. "I'll be right here." I let him hold on. I stood inside my son's embrace in the departure hall of San Diego International Airport and committed the moment to memory with the deliberate attention of a man who understood he was saying goodbye to something, not to Dorian exactly, but to the version of Dorian I had spent 8 years choosing to believe in, the son who had held his mother's hand at the end, the son I had wired $400,000 to without asking enough questions, the son who had stood in my kitchen that morning and set out a travel mug the way Helen used to. I stepped back and looked at him. "I will," I said. Dorian smiled wide open, entirely satisfied, and squeezed my shoulder once. Then he pocketed his keys, turned toward the exit, and walked away. His stride was loose and unhurried. He didn't look back. Not once. I watched him until he passed through the sliding doors and the morning swallowed him. The doors whispered shut behind him. I waited 30 seconds. Then I picked up my suitcase, turned away from the check-in counters, and walked straight back out through the same doors he had used. The Uber was a white Toyota, clean and unremarkable, driven by a man in his 50s who had a country music station playing low on the speaker and showed no interest in conversation. I was grateful for both. I gave the driver the corner address 1 block east of the house, as Renata had told me to do, and leaned back as the car nosed out of the departure lane and joined the flow of morning traffic along Rosecrans Street. The airport fell away behind us. In the side mirror, the orange roof tiles of the terminal caught the early sun one last time before the road bent and swallowed them. I dialed Renata. She answered on the first ring. "You're out." "I'm out," I told her. "He's gone." I saw him walk away myself. Good. She bit the word off clean, the way she always spoke when a plan had started moving. "Audio recording the moment you step through the front door. Not in the driveway. Not out on the street. The threshold is what matters, your house, your right, your evidence." "I understand," I said. "Eugene?" She paused just a beat. "Whatever state things are in when you get there, hold yourself together. We need you clear-headed, not emotional. Can you manage that?" Through the window, the broad streets of Pelican Bay rolled past manicured hedges, gated entries, palm trees arranged in flawless columns, like guards who had long ago given up actually watching. "Yes," I said. "I can manage that." We ended the call. A country music station drifted from the speaker, barely audible. The Toyota glided on through the quiet morning. Then, 53 minutes after Dorian had turned his back and walked into the terminal, my screen came alive. "Dorian." I stared at his name for 2 full seconds. Then I set the phone face up on the seat next to me and let it ring. He was calling to confirm. I grasped this the way a man grasps something he has spent 3 weeks studying, the way I once studied a set of structural drawings, not the surface details, but the bones underneath the load-bearing points, the places where the whole weight of a thing rested, and why. Dorian had done the arithmetic on the flight time. He had worked out the minute the cabin doors would seal and every phone aboard would go dark, leaving his father 10 days beyond reach. He needed to hear the plan click into place. The call dropped into silence. 12 seconds. Then his name lit the screen again. Dorian. I let the second call go unanswered as well. On the radio, someone talked about interest rates. The Toyota turned off the main road onto something narrower. The character of the neighborhood shifting around us, deeper lots, thicker trees, the particular quiet that belongs to old money, that no longer feels the need to make noise. The third call arrived before the second had fully given up. Dorian. 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 Past the fifth, I stopped keeping track and simply sat watching the screen flare and fade in the pale morning light. My son's name, pulsing like that, told its own story, the rhythm of a man who was discovering, perhaps for the first time, that he wasn't entirely in control. Every call I left unanswered was another crack in the structure of his certainty hairline at first, then widening into something that no amount of confidence could paper over. The driver caught my eye in the mirror. "Busy morning," something like that, I said. He gave a small nod and turned back to the road. By the time the Toyota eased to a stop at the corner of my block, Dorian's name had appeared on that screen 11 times. I knew the exact count because I had kept it, after all, the same way you track the gap between a lightning flash and the thunder that follows, measuring the distance the storm still has to travel. 11 calls in 53 minutes. It hadn't traveled far. It was right on top of me. I thanked the driver, pushed open the door, and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The air was already warm, carrying the faint brine of the ocean sitting 3 miles to the west. A sprinkler somewhere nearby swept back and forth over a front lawn each pass, throwing up brief handfuls of light. I left my phone where it was. I slipped it into my jacket pocket face against my leg and started up the street on foot. The block curved ahead the way it always had, easy and familiar, a curve I'd taken by car 1,000 times without once being conscious of it. This time I went slowly, each step deliberate, and somewhere in that walking I felt something inside me go quiet and settle. It wasn't quite courage. Courage needs doubt as its raw material, and the doubt in me had burned away. What remained felt more like the stillness that descends just before you set pen to something you cannot unsign. A kind of readiness. The house came into view around the bend, and there in the driveway alongside Dorian's SUV sat a bright red Mini Cooper that had absolutely no right to be there. I stopped at the foot of the drive and took it in. Dorian's black SUV angled in its usual spot the way it always was, the left rear tire drifting a few inches too close to the flower bed. And beside it, the red Mini Cooper, vivid as a hazard sign, sitting there with all the ease of something that considered itself welcome. I had laid eyes on that car before. 4 times per Garrett's surveillance reports, always at a remove, always gone before I could make myself reckon with what it meant. I worked my phone out of my pocket, opened the recording application Renata had set up 3 weeks earlier, and pressed the button. A small red dot appeared on the screen. I checked it, then returned the phone to my pocket microphone side out. I crossed to the front door and slid my key in. The lock turned with the same crisp click it had produced every single day for 27 years. A sound I'd heard 10,000 times returning from the office, from errands from the hospital during the final months of Helen's illness, those evenings when I'd come back to an empty house and stand just inside the door, unable for a moment to make my legs carry me further. The door opened. Cool air came first. Then the faint trace of eucalyptus from the candles Helen had always kept near the entrance still held in the grain of the wood, and the plaster long after the last of those candles was spent. And then beneath that, something else entirely. Music. Rising from the living room low and unhurried, and I knew the song before I'd taken another step. It was an Eva Cassidy record, the Songbird album, the record Helen and I had played on the night we closed on this house in 1997. We'd stood in the bare living room with a bottle of wine and not a stick of furniture turning slowly on the naked hardwood floor because Helen had believed that before a house could become a home, it needed to know music and the weight of people moving through it. Dorian had grown up with that album on Sunday mornings. He had reached for it deliberately, or maybe on instinct, and the instinct was somehow the worst possibility, the casual way a person reaches for something sacred and drapes it over something that doesn't deserve it. I went still just inside the entryway and didn't move another inch. Out of the living room came Brienne's laughter, easy and unguarded, the sound of a woman who felt entirely safe, entirely at home. Then Dorian's voice, lower and warmer than anything he'd aimed in my direction in months, murmuring something I couldn't make out, followed by the quiet knock of a wine glass being placed on the coffee table I'd brought back from a shop in Solana Beach in 2003. I pressed myself flat against the hallway wall and held still. "Did you check the flight tracker?" Brienne asked. Closer than I'd expected, her voice carrying easily into the hall. She was young, her voice bright and rising at the end of every sentence with the particular lilt of someone who phrases things as questions because she already knows the answers. "Checked it twice," Dorian said. His voice carried a smile in it, that quiet, private, self-satisfied warmth I hadn't heard from him in a very long time. "Wheels up 40 minutes ago. He's gone, Brienne. He is completely, totally gone." She laughed again, brighter now. "I still can't believe he just went just like that." "That's Dad," Dorian said. And the ease of it, the fond, almost tender dismissiveness with which he said it, reached into my chest and opened something I hadn't realized was still there to be opened. He trusts me. He's always trusted me. That's just who he is. I stayed where I was and breathed. Then I shifted my angle and looked through the gap at the edge of the doorframe. Brienne Coulter was curled into the left end of my white sectional legs, tucked under her, a wine glass loose in one hand. She was perhaps 29, dark-haired, with the unthinking prettiness of a person who has never once had cause to question it. Her head was tipped back in laughter at something Dorian had just said, her free hand resting easy on his arm. She had on a shirt I knew before I could say why I knew it. Navy blue. Soft Oxford cloth. 2 buttons open at the front. The left sleeve folded back to the elbow. Helen had bought me that shirt for my 63rd birthday. She'd sourced it from a small clothier in Connecticut, had the inside collar monogrammed AW in dark blue thread, and set it across the breakfast table with the quiet pleasure she always took in giving gifts that were both practical and carefully chosen. I had worn it to our last anniversary dinner before her diagnosis. I had worn it to her funeral, and Dorian had given it away. The way he had given away everything that was not his to give. Something moved through me in that moment that I cannot name cleanly. It was not anger, though anger was part of it. It was not grief, though grief was there too, older and heavier than anything else the morning had turned up. It was something beneath, both a cold, clarifying current that traveled from the base of my spine to the back of my throat and left everything in its path absolutely still. I straightened. I confirmed the red recording indicator was still visible at the edge of my pocket. I looked at my son and at the woman wearing my wife's last gift to me laughing on my sofa in my house. Then I eased back into the shadow of the hallway and listened a little longer. There is a difference between knowing a thing and hearing it spoken out loud in a room you built with your own hands. I had known for 2 weeks what Dorian was planning. I had read it on his screen, confirmed it, through Garrett's reports, absorbed it across 3 weeks of breakfast conversations, held with the calm attentiveness of a man who had resolved not to move until the moment was right. I had kept the knowledge at arm's length, the way you hold a diagnosis before you have truly reckoned with what it means for the shape of your days. That distance had served me. It had kept me upright. It had let me sit across the kitchen table from Dorian and ask how his week was going without anything in my voice betraying me. What I was not ready for was the specific quality of ease in the way he spoke about me. Not the content, the ease. He was talking to Brienne with the comfort of a man discussing something already settled, not a scheme he was anxious about, not a risk he was still managing, but an outcome he had already filed away, needing only time and his father's continued blindness to become real. There was no tension in how he said it. No guilt, no shadow of hesitation, no sign of the internal friction that a person with a conscience experiences when they are doing something they know is wrong. He sounded the way someone sounds, talking about the weather, assured, unremarkable, entirely at home in his own words. That quality, more than any specific thing he said, completed something inside me. "Okay, but walk me through the longer picture," Brienne was saying. Her voice had shifted from the one she'd been using earlier, less playful now, more focused, the register of a woman who recognized that the easy part of the morning was behind her and the business part had arrived. Like, what does this actually look like for us, long term? Dorian moved on the sofa. I heard the subtle creak of the frame taking his weight as he turned toward her. "Long term is straightforward," he said. "The trust names me as the primary heir. Everything in it, the house, the investment accounts, the remaining liquid assets, comes to me. It's not a question of if, it's a question of administration." "Administration," Brienne repeated. The word carried an edge. "He's 68, Dorian said. His voice had the patience of a man walking someone through something he considers obvious. "His health isn't good. His cardiologist has him on 3 medications. He doesn't sleep well, he doesn't exercise, and over the last 6 months, I've watched him become, I don't know, less present. He'll start a sentence and lose it. He'll ask me the same question twice in the same conversation." A pause. "I'm not saying anything is imminent. I'm saying the timeline takes care of itself." My jaw tightened. My hands, which I had pressed flat to the wall behind me to hold them steady, pressed harder. The plaster was cool and faintly rough against my palms. "That's a lot to carry," Brienne said. Her sympathy was the practiced offering of someone who has learned that deploying it at the right moment gets results. "It is what it is," Dorian said. "Look, the point is that I've been managing the situation for years. Every decision he makes, I'm involved. Every account, every investment, every medical appointment. He thinks of it as me helping. What it actually is me positioning." He let that word sit in the air a moment, apparently satisfied by it. "And when the time comes, I'll be exactly where I need to be." A wine glass moved. The sound of settling, both of them adjusting the sofa, shifting beneath them. "The house needs so much work," Brienne said. "Like aesthetically. It's so heavy in here. All these photographs everywhere. It's like living inside someone's memory." "That's exactly what it is," Dorian said. The laugh that followed was low and private and carried a contempt so thoroughly at home in him that it had long since stopped recognizing itself as contempt. 8 years. She's been gone for 8 years, and this house still looks like she stepped out for an errand and is expected back before dinner. He hasn't changed a single thing. He hasn't moved on. He hasn't processed it, or whatever the word is. Another pause during which I heard him drain what was left in his glass. I've walked past his room in the morning and heard him talking. Standing there in front of the nightstand, where her photograph is just talking to a picture out loud, as though she's still there. "That's heartbreaking," Brienne said. Her voice was softer now, and I noted with the detachment of a man logging evidence, rather than living a moment, that the softness was real this time, not a performance. She was capable of genuine pity. She simply found it less efficient than calculation in most situations and arranged her life accordingly. "It's more than heartbreaking," Dorian said. "It's the whole problem, actually. He never came back. After she died, he stayed inside that loss, and everything else, me, the business, the actual present, became secondary to maintaining the shrine." His voice changed, taking on something heavier, something I placed instantly, the tone he used, when he believed he was arriving at something important. I stopped expecting him to see what I was doing a long time ago. I stopped expecting gratitude. I just do it because someone has to, and because eventually the math will work out in my favor. And that's enough. I stood in the dark hallway of the house where Helen and I had raised our son, and listened to him describe tending to it as a positioning exercise. I want to be precise about what I felt, because the simpler version would be anger, and anger alone is not accurate. Anger was there. I could feel it in the set of my jaw, and in the pressure of my palms against the wall, and in the thin, bright line of heat that ran from my sternum to the back of my throat when Dorian used the word shrine in that particular tone. But beneath the anger was something older and larger and far quieter, the way bedrock sits older and larger and quieter than anything occurring on the surface above it. What I felt at the center of everything was the grief that belongs to a man who has loved someone without truly knowing them. Not for lack of trying. I had tried. I had driven him to meetings and offices. I had wired money without asking enough questions. I had sat across from him at tables, asked questions, received answers, and built from those answers an image of a son I then loved. With complete sincerity, never knowing, never letting myself know that the image had been assembled for my benefit, rather than drawn from anything real. The recording indicator in my jacket pocket was still active. Through the fabric, I could feel the faint warmth of the phone, the 3-second upload cycle running without interruption, every word Dorian spoke, being archived and time-stamped, and stored somewhere beyond anything he could reach. Renata had warned me when she set up the system that it would feel unnatural to stand there and simply listen rather than act. She had been right. It felt like watching a structural failure from a position of deliberate stillness, understanding that moving too soon would undo what waiting could accomplish, and holding that understanding against every instinct pulling the other way. Dorian said something to Brienne that I couldn't fully catch, something about a renovation, the kitchen, a timeline. She laughed lighter now, the practical talk giving way to something more domestic and imagined. A life was being drafted. Right there in my house on my sofa, in the light pouring through windows I had chosen and paid for, the two of them were laying out a future built on the assumption that I would be maneuvered out of the way at the appropriate moment. I had taken in enough. I peeled my hands away from the wall. My palms carried the ghost of the plaster for a second, that faint tingle you get when a surface has been pressed against far longer than you meant to press. I brought myself upright. One final check, the recorder still running. It was. 4 minutes of their words, their plans, their casual arithmetic about my decline, all of it already secured in Renata's encrypted server, already past anything Dorian could touch. He had never, I saw clearly now, truly been sitting across the table with me at all. I set my shoulders. One breath pulled in slowly through the nose, the same technique Dr. Cecile Harmon had been trying to get me to use for 15 years whenever my blood pressure was climbing. Out the same way. Then I moved out of the hallway and into the living room, and the light of the morning met me, and what came after that began. I have since read that the human eye needs approximately 2/10 of a second to recover from a camera flash. What experience taught me that morning is that 2/10 of a second is sufficient for a room to be completely transformed. The first burst hit the space like something solid, white, absolute, shadowless. Brienne's wineglass dropped before her mind had issued any instruction. Her fingers simply opening on instinct, the body making its own decision. The glass clipped the cushion edge, skipped sideways, and the red began its slow, unhurried journey across the white sectional. She was off the sofa almost before the glass had landed, one hand catching the front of Helen's shirt and clutching it in both fists, as though it were the last fixed point in a room that had stopped making sense. Dorian's response was something else entirely. He didn't flinch. He spun the sharp pivot of a man who has registered a sound behind him that his brain has already flagged as wrong. In the fraction of a moment before he knew what he was looking at, his face cycled through a sequence I read the way I once read the faces of buildings I was hired to evaluate. Disrupted calm first, then the tightening attention of someone locating a threat, then recognition, and with it, something I can only call a comprehensive collapse. Everything Dorian had been maintaining in his expression, the assurance, the composure, the practiced ease he carried like a second skin, went out at once, all of it. The way a structure blacks out when the power feeding it is cut at the source. I triggered the shutter a second time. That flash recorded what the first had produced. Dorian, half risen, his balance distributed wrong, one palm driven into the cushion to keep himself from going over. Brienne behind him and to the left, still white-knuckled on the shirt. Her lips parted around a word she hadn't yet decided to say. Red wine still spreading through the white fabric. On the coffee table, 2 glasses and the bottle they had been sharing since, by Dorian's own calculation, sometime before I had landed. Dad. His voice came out shattered, the syllable fracturing on its way out. When did you... How are you here? I gave him nothing. I raised the phone again. Flash. He stepped toward me, not a charge, not yet, but the leading edge of motion from someone who hadn't settled on an action, but had already ruled out stillness. His hand came up between us, palm out, the gesture ancient and pointless, the body doing what it has always done when it has nothing better to do. Stop, he said. Put it down. Just put it down, and we can talk about this. Okay. We can talk about this right now. Take one more step in my direction, I said, and I call the police. I tell them you tried to physically interfere with me inside my own home, and I pursue charges. Is that clear to you? Dorian went still. The outstretched hand held its position a beat longer, then fell away, as though whatever had been holding it up had simply let go. Behind him, Brienne had retreated to the far end of the sectional and folded herself into it, knees pulled in close. The color gone from her face. The specific pallor of someone who has just calculated that the situation she walked into is a different order of serious than the one she was briefed on. The photographs, I said, are already out of your reach. Every image captured from the moment I crossed the threshold of this house has been automatically backed up to an encrypted server run by my attorney's office. You could pull this phone from my hand in the next 5 seconds, and nothing on that server would change. I need you to sit with that before you decide what to do next. I watched it arrive in him. It traveled through him the way something cold travels through a system built for warmth, probing every joint, every seam, every place where things were held together less firmly than they appeared. He was 38 years old. He was not a slow man. He had invested 3 weeks in a scheme he was confident was sealed against every contingency. And now I watched him grasp in the time it takes to exhale that the scheme hadn't been outflanked At one corner or two, it had been seen entire from the beginning by the single person he had staked everything on, never suspecting a thing. His legs went first. Not a full collapse, he caught the sofa arm on the way down, knuckles going white against the upholstery, the tendons in his forearm pulling taut with the work of halting a fall that had started before he chose it. He held himself there a moment, neither standing nor down, and then did something I had not anticipated. He let go of the armrest. He drew himself up slightly, and then sank down by his own choice, not dropping, but descending until both knees were on the hardwood of the living room, where his mother and I had spent 18 years. A sound from Brienne in the corner. He didn't turn toward it. Dad. Different from how that word usually arrived, hollowed out the layer of managed warmth he typically wore over it, stripped entirely away. That warmth, I understood now, had never been warmth at all. It had been a technique. Dad, I hear you. I understand what you're saying to me, but please, please, just give me 1 minute. I made a mistake. I know that. I know exactly what I did, and I know it was wrong, and I am telling you right now, right here, that I will end it today. She leaves today. You will never see her again. You will never hear her name again. And whatever you need from me to make this right, I will do it. Whatever it takes. I looked at my son there on the floor of this house. There is a discipline in keeping your eyes on something that costs you to see, and I had been building that discipline since the afternoon I walked past his open laptop. I held my gaze on him now with the same steadiness, without hatred, without the clean resolution of a man whose feelings have organized themselves tidily, but with the worn, unsparing clarity of someone who loved his child and knew what his child had done and was required by honesty to carry both of those things at once. I will end it, Dorian said again. Something was thickening in his throat. I swear to you, whatever I was doing, whatever reasoning I had, it's finished. It stops right now. Put the phone down and let's sort through the rest of it side by side. The business, the house, everything, we can sit down and work it out. Dad, that's what we do. You and me, just you and me, I said. The two words halted him as decisively as a barrier dropped across a road. He raised his eyes to mine from the floor. His face was wet. I couldn't have said exactly when the tears had started, only that they were there, moving in two thin lines from the outer corners of his eyes down toward his jaw. What I was about to walk into that house and face had been building for years, and what I uncovered in those few quiet minutes would cost me something I can never get back, but give me something far greater in return. Before we get there, tell me this. If you discovered someone close to you had been quietly working against you, would you confront them on the spot, or would you gather every piece of proof first and say nothing? Whether those tears came from something genuine, or simply from the terror of watching everything he'd built for himself come apart in real time, I couldn't say. And somewhere in the past few minutes, I had crossed the point where the distinction would have mattered to me. I want to tell you something, I said, and then I want you to hear what follows it. Dorian went still. I have tried, I said, for 8 years to be the father your mother asked me to be. I have signed checks without asking what they were for. I have sat across from you at dinner and listened to you talk about a business built entirely on her money, as though you had raised it from nothing yourself. I extended you a degree of trust you neither earned nor honored. I kept my voice level, not cold level. There is a difference. And I want you to be clear that none of that was weakness. I want you to understand that. Every choice I made because I loved you and because she asked it of me, and because for 8 years I held on to the belief that the son she was holding at the end was still reachable somewhere inside you. Something moved across his face, a flicker of something undefended and real there, and gone so fast I would have lost it, without the particular quality of attention that years of grief had trained into me. Heidi, I believed that this morning, I said. Even standing in the hallway of this house listening to you say those words in that voice, I believed it. The tears on his face continued without interruption. And then I stopped, I said. And I raised the phone. The final flash filled the room with a light so complete and so impersonal that for one instant it dissolved everything. The sofa, the wine spreading through the cushion, the broken glass, the man on his knees, the woman pressed into the corner, all of it gone, leaving only the bare, unnarrated fact of what the morning had been. Then the light died, and the room was simply what it was. I lowered the phone. Not as a gesture, not with any deliberateness, I set it down the way you put aside an instrument once the task it was made for is finished. The California light came through the floor-to-ceiling windows with the same unhurried generosity it brought to everything falling equally on Dorian on the floor, and Brienne in the corner, and the dark spread of wine moving slowly through the white sectional, making no distinction among them. Dorian was still on his knees. His hands rested open on his thighs, palms turned upward, the posture of a man who has run out of things to present and is offering the emptiness itself as a kind of proof. The surface he had maintained for as long as I could remember, that composed, calibrated face, the one that understood appearance as its own form of argument, had failed entirely. What remained underneath was younger and more exposed and more frightened than anything I had seen from him since he was a boy. I studied him for a long moment before I spoke. I want to tell you something about your mother, I said. Not because it changes what happens next, but because you should hear it, and because I think this is the last time I'll say it to you directly. Dorian's jaw set. He said nothing. The year we got married, Helen was working 3 jobs at once. She drafted architectural plans during the day at a firm in Escondido that paid her less than the men beside her doing identical work. 2 evenings a week, she kept the books for a dry cleaning business on Grand Avenue owned by a man she described as relentlessly unpleasant. Saturday mornings, she arranged flowers at a shop on Valley Parkway because she said it was the 1 hour of the week that was entirely hers. I kept my pace unhurried, and my voice, even the way Helen herself had always delivered the things that mattered most. She did that for 2 years. Every dollar she didn't spend went into a savings account she labeled in her own handwriting in the small notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer. Future. That was the word she wrote. Future. Something shifted in Dorian's expression, not softening more like the movement of something tectonic, slow, and immense happening well below the surface. In 1993, she was offered a partnership at the firm where she had been for 9 years. It would have tripled her income. It was the thing she had been building toward since before I met her. I paused. She turned it down because we had agreed that you needed a parent home after school, and she made the decision herself without being asked that it would be her. She never brought up the partnership again. Not once. I only learned what it had been worth when I went through her professional files after she died. Brienne had gone completely still in the corner of the sofa. She was watching me with the look of someone who has arrived somewhere they didn't expect to be and is trying to take up as little space as possible. The trust she left wasn't an accident, and it wasn't luck, I continued. It was 30 years of careful, unglamorous choices by a woman who understood that the people who love you build things designed to outlast the moment. She built that trust for you, Dorian. She put your name in it because she believed, because we both believed, that you would become the kind of man equal to what she had made. Dorian's hands had closed on his thighs. The wetness on his face had dried at the edges into something pale and stark. She wouldn't have been angry about this morning, I said. Anger would have required surprise, and your mother was not a woman who was easily surprised by the people she loved. What she would have felt was grief. Quiet, thorough grief, the kind she met by sitting with it, feeling it completely, and then turning with her usual practicality toward what came next. I held his gaze. I wanted you to know that. I wanted you to understand the precise weight of what you chose to do with what she built. For a moment, Dorian said nothing. His face moved through several things in sequence: grief calculation, something that might have grown into genuine remorse if it hadn't been overtaken before it could root. Then he got to his feet, and the boy I had briefly seen vanished, and what stood there instead was the man who had spent the morning telling his girlfriend how thoroughly he had his father handled. You want to stand there and eulogize her at me? His voice came out cracked and hot, less like anger than something that had been under pressure too long and had finally found a seam. You've been eulogizing her for 8 years, Dad. Every room in this house is a eulogy. Every conversation you have eventually circles back into one. I have been living inside your grief since I was 30 years old, and you have never once stopped to ask whether that was something I could carry. Brienne said his name from the corner very quietly. He didn't acknowledge her. I kept this company running. His voice dropped into something that straddled accusation and confession. The register of a man who had blurred the line between them so thoroughly that it no longer felt like a line. I took your calls at 11 o'clock at night when you couldn't sleep. I drove you to appointments you were perfectly capable of driving yourself to because it made you feel less alone. I sat at this table with you 3 times a week and listened and showed up and did every last thing a son is supposed to do. And not once did you look across that table and see someone who was also trying to build something. You saw someone to take care of, someone who needed managing. His hands were trembling now, the fine, involuntary shaking of a body holding more charge than it was built to contain. When does it stop? When does any of this actually become mine? The room held its quiet for a moment after he finished. I let it. Long enough to feel the full weight of what he'd said and to register that some of it was not entirely wrong. That grief does settle into the rooms of a house. That the people who go on living in those rooms don't always get to choose whether it stays. Then I spoke. Section 3 of the Callaway Trust, I said. My voice had come down to something very quiet, not for lack of certainty, but because certainty at its most complete has no need for volume. The Pelican Bay property was purchased exclusively with funds from Helen's family inheritance and is titled solely in my name. California Probate Code. Section 21,102 is unambiguous. Separate property of this nature cannot be transferred, encumbered, or claimed under any circumstances involving a verified breach of the trust's conduct provisions. This house is mine. It will remain mine. Dorian's mouth opened. Whatever words he had ready did not come. Section 7, the $1.2 million provided as funding capital for Callaway Property Group, originated in its entirety from the trust fund. California law is equally clear on this point. Misappropriation of trust capital, whether through negligence or deliberate misuse, creates an immediate and enforceable repayment obligation. The interest has been accruing from the date of each transfer. Renata has the figures. Brienne pressed herself further back into the corner of the sofa, pulling her knees to her chest, making herself as small and unnoticeable as she could manage. Helen's shirt, the navy Oxford with the monogram inside the collar, had slipped off one shoulder. She didn't reach to fix it. Section 11, I said. The morality clause. Any named beneficiary of the Callaway Family Trust who undertakes actions contrary to the grantor's physical, financial, or emotional well-being, forfeits all inheritance rights immediately and without recourse upon presentation of verified evidence to the trustee. I let that settle. The evidence has already been submitted, the upload completed while we were standing here talking. Dorian's face had gone the gray of old concrete, not pale, not white, but the specific tonelessness of something from which everything useful has been drawn out. His hands were still shaking. He looked down at them as though he wasn't entirely sure they were his. "You have 30 minutes," I said. "Both of you. Personal belongings, only clothing, electronics, anything that was yours before you came through that door. Everything else stays exactly where it is." I walked across the living room. I moved around the broken wine glass on the hardwood floor, the one Brienne had dropped. When the first flash went off, its stem snapped at the base. The bowl resting on its side with the last of its contents spread in a thin red arc. I reached the front door and pulled it open. The morning entered behind me warm and unhurried, the way May mornings in Pelican Bay always were. The kind of morning entirely indifferent to what had taken place inside. It simply went on being beautiful as it would have regardless. I walked down the front path without looking back. My steps were even on the gravel. My hands were steady. On the 11th step, my phone buzzed at my hip. I stopped, drew it from my pocket, read the 4 words on the screen. "Philip, I'm already on my way." I stood on the front path in the morning light and read those 4 words twice. Then I slid the phone back into my pocket, straightened my jacket, and walked to the end of the path to wait for my brother. 4 words. They landed with the particular weight of a sentence that needed nothing added to it. No explanation, no qualification, no hedge against the possibility that his presence might not be wanted. He was 71 years old and had been my older brother for every one of those years. In that time, we had built between us the kind of shorthand that renders long explanations unnecessary. I had called him from a dark bedroom after reading what was on my son's laptop. He had listened to everything. And now, 40 minutes after I had walked out of my own house for the first time, without knowing when I would feel at home in it, again Philip's green F-150 was turning into the driveway. He parked in the spot where Dorian's SUV had sat that morning and came up the front path without hurrying, which was entirely like him. Philip had never been a man who ran toward hard things, but he had never been one to step around them either. He was broader in the shoulders than me, and he carried our father's gray at his temples and our father's habit of pressing his lips together when something moved him that he wasn't going to let show. He reached the door and regarded me for a moment across the threshold. Then he opened his arms, and I walked into them, and we stood there in the doorway of that house for a moment, neither of us speaking, because nothing that needed to be said between us was left uncovered by the fact of standing there together. "You eaten anything?" he asked when we stepped back. "Coffee," I said. He made a sound that conveyed his full opinion of that answer, and followed me to the kitchen. We sat at the table where I had eaten breakfast with Dorian every morning for 2 years. Same table, same chairs, same window overlooking the wraparound back porch where Dorian had stood on a Saturday afternoon in April, speaking on his phone while I sat inside, reading words on his laptop screen that dismantled everything I had believed about my son. Philip wrapped both hands around his mug and listened without once cutting in while I walked him through the morning, from the moment we left the driveway to the moment I had stood at the open front door, given Dorian 30 minutes, and walked away. When I finished, Philip sat with the quiet of a man who was not short of things to say, but was taking care about which ones belonged here. "She would have done the same," he said at last. He meant Helen. He had called her that she/her since the first Christmas she joined our family 39 years ago, and the pronoun had never needed explaining between us. "Quieter about it probably, but the same." "I hope so," I said. Philip looked at me across the table with the unhurried steadiness of a man who had known me since before I knew myself, and who had long since stopped being surprised by me. "You did right," he said. "Every step of it." I didn't answer that. Some things are better received in silence than acknowledged aloud. We had moved to a second cup when the front doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked at Philip, who raised one eyebrow, the same expression our mother used to call his thinking face, because it looked the same whether he was genuinely thinking or simply buying himself a moment. I crossed the hallway and opened the door. Nadia Elroy was standing on the front step. She was 36 years old, slight, dark-eyed, wearing the particular careful composure of someone who had driven somewhere faster than she meant to, and spent the final 2 minutes of the drive talking herself into appearing calm. She taught third grade at Crestview Elementary in La Jolla and had been married to Dorian for 6 years. In those 6 years, she had become, without any apparent effort or strategy, one of the few things connected to my son that I could think about without reservation. 2 winters ago, she had shown up at my door with soup and a paperback novel when a respiratory infection had kept me flat for 4 days. Every October, on the anniversary of Helen's death, a small arrangement of pale yellow tulips arrived at the house with a card in Nadia's precise, legible handwriting. She had never once referred to those gestures afterward. By every measure I had, she was a substantially better person than the man she had married. She was also, from the look on her face, working from a version of events that Dorian had constructed for her. Eugene. Her voice had the tightness of someone who has been anxious in a car for 40 minutes and is trying not to lead with it. Dorian called me. He said you came back from the airport, that something happened, that you were confused, that you were saying things that didn't make sense. Her eyes moved quickly over my face, searching for signs of a medical episode. He said he was scared. Are you all right? So that was the frame he had chosen. I had anticipated something like it. Dorian had always been quick to identify the story that would produce the most useful response, and a worried wife arriving to manage a confused elderly father served him far better than a wife who came in knowing the truth. "Come inside, Nadia," I said. "I'm not confused. There was no episode. But there are things I need to show you, and I'd like you to sit down first." She glanced past me at Philip, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway with his coffee. He gave her a small nod, the nod of a man who has just heard everything and is telling her without words that what she is about to hear can be trusted. She stepped inside. All 3 of us were around the kitchen table. I laid my phone face up on the surface between Nadia and me, held her gaze, and spoke plainly. "Dorian reached out to you because he needed somebody to walk in here and change the direction things are heading," I said. "No one is having a medical emergency. What's actually happening is right here." I hit play. Dorian's voice rose out of the speaker and settled over the kitchen, the loose, private ease of a man who is certain he cannot be heard by anyone who matters. Brienne's laughter wove through it, open, unself-conscious, belonging to a woman who had made herself entirely at home somewhere that was not her house. The exchange about the flight tracker played through. Then Dorian's voice shifted into a lower, more familiar key, the register of fond contempt, the tone a person uses for something they have written off completely. "He's just an old man who never moved on. He still talks to Mom's photo every morning like she can hear him. He's pathetic. He's soft. He always has been." Nadia's hands loosely resting in her lap until that moment began to close. Slowly, not in a snap, the way a hand tightens when someone is fighting every instinct their body has and barely winning. The recording moved on, Dorian characterizing the trust as complicated but workable. Dorian remarking, "It's just a matter of when." Dorian noting that he writes checks whenever I ask Breezy about it, as though describing a household errand rather than a son extracting money from his father. When the playback ended, a particular silence took the room, the kind that settles into a space after something irreversible has been spoken aloud, weighting the air, changing the proportions of things. Nadia held perfectly still for a full 10 seconds. jaw-firm eyes trained on the phone sitting between us hands, still cinched into those controlled fists. Then she drew a slow breath in through her nose, let it go evenly, and brought her eyes up to mine. "How long has she been coming here?" she asked. Every trace of warmth had drained from her voice. Flat, precise. The voice of a woman who has made a deliberate calculation that clarity serves her better than feeling right now, and who is holding to that decision by force of will. Garrett Finch, the investigator. Renata documented 4 confirmed visits across the past 3 months, I said. The true number almost certainly runs higher. His surveillance started 3 weeks before this morning's confrontation. Nadia sat with that. The breath she pulled in was audible, sharp enough that I caught it, and she didn't release it all the way, keeping what remained somewhere deep in her chest, compressed into something she would unpack later privately on her own terms. "He signed my name," she said. Quiet, certain, not phrased as a question, not launched as an accusation, stated the way you state a thing you have half known for some time and are only now permitted to say out loud. "On something financial, didn't he?" The bluntness of it stopped me. "Renata is still working through the paperwork," I said, choosing each word. "But yes, there is grounds to believe that is what occurred." The look Nadia turned on me then carried grief and fury, and under both of those something colder and more structural, the expression of a woman whose worst-founded suspicion has just been confirmed in writing, who is already quietly rearranging the weight-bearing walls inside herself. "Would you mind if I used your kitchen?" she said. "There's a call I need to make." "Go ahead," I told her. She got up, crossed to the far end of the room, and dialed. Philip looked at me from across the table. Beyond the window, late afternoon light stretched long and gold across the wraparound back porch, a distinctly late spring quality to it, the kind you only get when the marine layer has stayed out to sea and the sun is allowed to run its full course. Along the back fence in the flower bed, Helen had put in back in 2000, a single white camellia was holding the last of that light in its petals, as though it meant to keep it for itself. Philip said nothing. Neither did I. There was nothing that needed saying. He had the engine going before Nadia's taillights had finished rounding the corner. He never asked whether I wanted to go. He just looked at me across the table, read my face, and said, "Pack a bag, a week's worth." I didn't push back. I went upstairs and moved through the bedroom the way a person moves when the body knows what to do and the mind has stepped aside. And I was back down in 15 minutes, carrying a duffel and the particular hollowed-out steadiness that arrives after you have burned through every last reserve you were storing. We secured the house. I punched in the alarm code, something I hadn't bothered with in months, back in the days when I still assumed that whatever threatened the quiet of this house would come from the street, rather than from inside it. Then I pulled out behind Philip's green F-150 and followed him through the neighborhood, and did not turn to look at the house once we'd made the corner and it had slipped behind us. The drive south on the 5 to San Diego ran an hour and 40 minutes. Philip kept a steady pace a few car lengths out in front, and I tracked his taillights through the landscape dimming around us. The industrial sprawl giving way to hillsides, the hills easing down into the coastal plain, the sky graduating from orange through purple into the deep, particular blue that belongs to Southern California evenings when the day has finally spent itself completely. Dorian started calling at 7:43. I know the precise time because I checked the dashboard clock on the first ring, then turned the phone face down on the passenger seat and kept going. Another call at 7:51. Again at 8:04. As the night deepened, the gaps compressed. 8:17, 8:22, 8:36. You could read a man's interior state from the shrinking space between those attempts. Desperation doesn't produce evenly metered intervals. It piles up, pushes the next call forward, as if sheer frequency might substitute for any argument he can no longer make. The calls went quiet by midnight. I had tallied 14. I didn't return a single one. Not that night, not across the following morning, not during any stretch of the 4 days I spent occupying Philip's spare bedroom with the sound of the Pacific carrying in from 2 blocks off, trying to locate again the feeling of waking without dread already present in my chest. Settled there like something that had taken up permanent residence. Philip's place was a modest craftsman sitting 3 streets inland from the water in the Ocean Beach neighborhood, the kind of house someone had the good sense to buy before the area found itself on a map, and which had grown better slowly over years through the specific attentiveness of someone who actually lived there and wasn't merely waiting on appreciation. There was a woodworking shop in what had been the garage, a kitchen that carried the standing scent of coffee and sawdust, and 2 golden retrievers named Biscuit and Remy, who hit me at the door with a full-force, guileless joy I hadn't known until I felt it, that I'd been needing that badly. Biscuit slept across the foot of my bed each night. I was grateful for that in ways I couldn't have articulated easily to anyone who hadn't spent 8 years in a bed sized for 2 people occupying it alone. Dorian's messages came in surges across those first 3 days, and I went through them with the removed attention of a man reading case files that belonged to somebody else's situation entirely. The first morning apologies. Polished and deliberate, the work of someone who has always understood how to compose himself for an audience, now directing that same skill at the performance of contrition. The second morning anger. Grievances about provocation, about being set up, about my readiness to tear apart what Helen had assembled through 30 years of patient effort. The third morning brought something I hadn't seen coming, 1 message, 4 lines, all the scaffolding stripped away, saying only that he was scared, that he couldn't see what was ahead of him, and that he was sorry in a register that had nothing at all to do with legal exposure. I went through that one 3 times. Then I put the phone down on the nightstand, face toward the wood, and went to pour coffee because certain things call for acknowledgement and certain things call for space. And I hadn't landed on which column this one belonged in yet, and I wasn't going to force the answer. On the 3rd afternoon, I made the drive back up to La Jolla to see Dr. Cecile Harmon. Cecile was 64 years old, a general internist who had been my doctor from the year Helen and I settled in Pelican Bay, and who had built up over those years the particular standing that belongs to someone who has witnessed you at your lowest and chosen every time to give you the truth, rather than something easier. She had treated Helen as well, had guided the early phase of her pancreatic illness with an exactness and a care I never found the right moment to thank her for properly, and had sat across from me in her office on a gray December afternoon in 2014 and given me the final prognosis without flinching and without excess. She was, in short, someone I trusted without reservation, which is why I had phoned her from Philip's kitchen that morning and asked whether she could fit me in. She had me in the examination room by 3 o'clock. Cecile took my blood pressure, studied the numbers with a brief tightening around her mouth that I knew to be clinical concern, and ran the cuff a second time with a different instrument to be sure. She listened to my heart with the concentrated focus of someone who had no interest in approximate answers. Then she set the stethoscope on the counter and looked at me with the particular directness she brought to conversations she regarded as serious. "Your systolic is 172, she said. "That's meaningfully above your baseline. Your heart rhythm is regular, that's the good news. The bad news is that your body has classified whatever occurred this week as an active physical crisis, and it is behaving accordingly." She paused. "I need you to tell me plainly what's been going on." So I told her. Not the whole of it, not every detail of the plan or how it unfolded, but the essential shape, the discovery, the confrontation, the legal proceedings now in motion, the 4 days in San Diego. She listened without breaking in hands, resting in her lap, her face neither surprised nor judging, simply collected in the manner of someone assembling information they intend to act on. "How is your sleep?" she asked when I was through. "Better than I would have predicted," I said honestly. "The first night was rough, since then reasonably solid. And eating—" "Philip feeds people when he runs out of other ways to help," I said. "I've been looked after on that front." The corner of her mouth shifted slightly. That counts for something. She pulled her prescription pad over, wrote a few lines, and slid the paper across to me. "I want you on this for 30 days. It'll bring the pressure down without making you feel dulled or underwater. Back in my office in 3 weeks for a follow-up." She held my eyes. "And I want you to actually hear this. What your body is doing right now is not a sign of weakness. It's a proportionate response to a serious traumatic event. You are 68 years old, and you walked into a confrontation that would have undone men 30 years younger. The fact that you came to my office today, instead of an emergency room, says something real about who you are." I had no answer for that, so I offered none, which Cecile had long understood as my way of saying thank you. She rose to go, then stopped and turned back. Something in her professional bearing shifted the way it does when someone who has been speaking as a doctor decides to speak as a person instead. "Helen used to ask me," she said quietly. "In those final months, she would ask whether I believed you would be all right afterward." A pause waited with everything it carried. I told her yes every time she asked. I meant it every time. Another pause. "I still mean it, Eugene. I want you to know that." My throat closed around whatever words might have come. I made no attempt to force them. I drove back to Philip's house through the late afternoon traffic along Cabrillo Memorial Drive. The ocean showed itself to my left in long blue intervals between buildings. The prescription rested on the passenger seat next to my phone, and Cecile's parting words moved through me the way certain things do when they have located exactly where they were always supposed to land. Renata called as I was turning onto Phillips Street. "The filing is complete," she said, skipping any greeting. Her voice had the tight energy of someone who had been running at full capacity for 4 days and had arrived at the first moment where the work could breathe. "San Diego County Superior Court petition filed this morning. Hearing in 3 weeks." A brief pause. "And Eugene, Nadia's attorney, called me an hour ago. Nadia has agreed to cooperate fully. Her testimony, combined with everything Garrett documented and everything you recorded, gives us something that Conrad Stearns is not going to be able to argue his way out of." I pulled into Philip's driveway and sat with the engine still running. Through the front window, I could make out Philip moving around the kitchen. The interior light, warm and yellow, spilling out across the porch, where Biscuit lay with his chin flat on his paws, watching the street with the patient, undemanding attention that dogs bring to everything without effort. 3 weeks, I said. 3 weeks, Renata confirmed. "And Eugene, you did everything right, every single step. Whatever comes next, you did it right." I switched off the engine. For a moment, I just sat in the stillness of the driveway, in the particular quiet of a day that has made up its mind to end. The prescription sat on the seat beside me. Cecile's words were still finding their footing somewhere in my chest. Renata's voice was still in my ear. 3 weeks. I got out of the car. Biscuit lifted his head from the porch and tracked me across the driveway, with his whole body communicating a welcome that asked nothing in return. I went inside. The hearing room inside San Diego County Superior Court was bright and very still, the kind of space that absorbed sound and gave it back stripped of everything except its bare meaning. Renata and I arrived at 8:40 in the morning, 20 minutes ahead of the scheduled start. She wore charcoal gray and carried a leather portfolio holding the organized sequence of everything we had assembled across the past 2 months. The trust documents the financial statements, Garrett's surveillance reports, the audio recording, the time-stamped photographs, the bank records showing the unauthorized withdrawals, and the forensic handwriting analysis, confirming that 2 of the 3 forged signatures were signed by someone other than the account holder, attributed to Nadia rather than Eugene. We settled at the petitioner's table. I placed my hands flat on the surface before me and took in the room. Dorian came in 4 minutes later, alongside Conrad Stearns. Stearns was a large man in his late 40s, broad across the chest, carrying the practiced ease of an attorney who had built his reputation on speed and force, talking faster and louder than the other side, until the pressure of his delivery manufactured the appearance of substance. He wore an expensive suit and moved through the space as though it already belonged to him, which I recognized as craft rather than conviction. Dorian walked beside him in a dark suit that didn't sit right at the shoulders. His face was drawn and drained the shadows beneath his eyes, the deep gray of someone who had gone 3 weeks without proper sleep. He didn't look at me when he took his seat. Nadia came in alone and sat in the row directly behind Renata and me. She wore a simple navy dress and brought nothing with her except a small envelope in her right hand. When I turned briefly to acknowledge her, she gave me one composed nod. Her eyes were dry and absolutely steady. Judge Patricia Aldridge entered at 9 o'clock on the dot, and the room rose. She was a trim woman in her late 50s, with close-cropped silver hair, carrying the unhurried authority of someone who had been rendering consequential decisions for a very long time and no longer found them taxing. She reviewed the case file for exactly 90 seconds before looking up. Stearns got to his feet immediately. Your Honor, what we are looking at here is a fundamental misreading of trust law paired with a coordinated effort to isolate and financially punish my client. Mr. Stearns, Judge Aldridge said, still reading the document before her, the trust agreement is explicit on what constitutes a moral conduct breach. Is what I have in front of me the original notarized trust instrument? It is, Your Honor, Renata said. And the signatures appearing on these financial authorization forms, your forensic analysis establishes they were not executed by the account holder. Confirmed by 2 independent handwriting experts. Your Honor, one retained by our office, one court-appointed. Stearns pressed again, louder now. Your Honor, my client disputes the characterization of these transactions as unauthorized. He operated under a reasonable belief that as sole beneficiary, he is not the sole beneficiary. Judge Aldrich delivered this with the flat precision of someone correcting a simple arithmetic error rather than litigating a point of law. The trust designates the petitioner as the primary beneficiary of his own assets during his lifetime. Your client holds a contingent interest. Those are not equivalent positions, Mr. Stearns. Stearns opened his mouth. The judge continued without pause. Furthermore, the audio recording entered into evidence contains statements by your client that bear directly on the Elder financial abuse filing. This court finds that evidence admissible under California Evidence Code, Section 633, given that the recording was made by the property owner within his own home. Stearns sat down slowly, the way a large structure settles when the load bearing down on it finally exceeds what it was built to hold. It was at that point that Dorian's attorney made one final move. He called Nadia as a witness, his voice carrying the careful optimism of a man playing what he still believed was a live card. Nadia rose from her seat. She ran her hands down the front of her dress. She moved toward the front of the room with the unhurried, settled pace of someone whose mind had been made up long before she walked through the courthouse doors, and who had nothing left to reconsider. She took her position before Judge Aldridge, then turned and found Dorian with her eyes the first time, as best I could observe, that she had looked at him directly since the proceedings began. Something in Dorian's face gave way the way a pain gives way under stress. Not gone, not yet, but split through in a manner that would not be mended. Mrs. Elroy Stearns began choosing his words with care. Drawing on your experience of living alongside and observing your husband across 6 years of marriage, would you describe him as your honor? Nadia said, turning toward the judge rather than the attorney, her voice carrying no tremor whatsoever. I have nothing to say in my husband's defense. Then she went back to her seat. Judge Aldridge read out her ruling 12 minutes later. The Pelican Bay property stood as the petitioner's separate asset. Callaway Property Group was directed to repay $1.2 million in misappropriated trust capital, with interest running from the date of each unauthorized transfer. The morality clause was formally triggered, extinguishing Dorian's inheritance rights entirely. A further finding of elder financial abuse under California Welfare and Institutions Code, Section 15,610, was entered into the record and forwarded to the district attorney's office. Dorian did not move through any of it. When the gavel fell, he brought his hands up and covered his face. I collected my documents, said a quiet word of thanks to Renata, and got to my feet. Walking out, I came within 3 feet of my son. His eyes stayed down. My feet did not slow. Brianne Coulter was gone by Thursday evening, 2 days after the verdict. Dorian conveyed this to me later, not face to face, not through any exchange I initiated, but by way of Renata, who had it from Nadia's attorney, who was in contact with Dorian's new counsel as the divorce took shape. The story that reached me was spare and undramatic, which felt about right. Brianne had taken a single bag. The red Mini Cooper had rolled backward out of its space in front of the Chula Vista apartment Dorian had taken on with the last money he had, and that was the whole of it. No note behind. His number blocked before she hit the freeway. Dorian called her 11 times that first evening. I know this because he mentioned it sideways in a message that arrived 4 days after the verdict, the first one that carried neither blame nor apology, only a bare account of where things stood, the kind of message someone sends once every strategy has collapsed, and all that remains is to describe the wreckage. He wrote, "She left. I don't think she was ever really in it for me." He was not asking for anything back. I gave him nothing. That line stayed with me longer than I would have expected. I don't think she was ever really in it for me. As far as I could tell, it was the most truthful thing Dorian had put in writing to me in years, and what made it sad, genuinely sad, was that he could see that in Brianne with such precision while remaining wholly unable to turn the same clear eye on what he had done to his own father. That variety of partial self-knowledge functions as its own sentence, I think. It reliably guarantees that a person extracts the least available wisdom from whatever disaster has just found them. Nadia filed for divorce the Monday after the verdict, which happened to be the first morning she returned to her classroom and walked her third graders through long division, as though the previous 3 weeks had been a minor interruption, rather than something that had taken the floor out from under her life. Her attorney moved at the same time on the forgery claim, a standalone civil action seeking damages for the unauthorized use of her signature on financial instruments, for the reputational exposure that created, and for the harm of learning that the man she had built a life with across 6 years had been using her legal identity as a tool drawn on without her awareness, without her permission, without even the courtesy of a lie told directly to her face. Renata reached me with news of the filing on a Tuesday afternoon. I was standing in the paint aisle of a hardware store in La Jolla, turning 2 sample cards over in my hand, one a warm ivory one, a soft sage trying to arrive at a decision about the living room walls. Nadia's civil case is going to move cleanly, Renata said. Dorian doesn't have enough left to put up much of a fight. The forgery documentation is solid. My guess is it resolves within 60 days. Good, I said. How are you doing? She asked. It was the first time those words had come from her, without a professional frame around them, going all the way back to the morning I'd phoned her from the bedroom after the laptop. I glanced down at the 2 paint chips in my hand. I'm at a hardware store, I said, choosing paint colors, a beat of quiet, and then Renata laughed. Not the measured warmth she brought to her working relationships, but something unguarded and real. That might be the healthiest thing you've said to me in months, she told me. I went with the warm linen. Getting back inside the house and truly returning to it turned out to be slower work than I'd counted on, more painful in some passages, more necessary in others than I had let myself anticipate. I'd made arrangements while still in San Diego for a moving company to come the Friday after the verdict and clear out Dorian's things, the clothing, the electronics, the few sticks of furniture he had brought with him when he moved in. I'd asked Philip to be there in my place. Philip said yes without any deliberation, and he told me afterward that Dorian had shown up to oversee the removal, that the 2 of them had spoken perhaps 12 words to each other, and that Dorian was gone before the truck pulled away. I came back on a Saturday morning. Everything about the house read as it always had. The cedar shake roof, the forest green shutters. Helen had picked out the gravel path, cutting through the front garden, the smell of eucalyptus and salt air that had been the constant atmosphere of 30 years here. And still it registered as altered, the way a place shifts after something consequential has moved through it. Not haunted, changed. The way a room can feel rearranged even when every piece of furniture is exactly where it started. I stood in the entryway briefly, then moved to the kitchen and put coffee on. The white sectional was the first order of business. A consignment service took it away the Monday following my return. Not that I despised it precisely, but it had accumulated meaning I no longer wanted sitting in the middle of my home. Brienne's wine stain had been treated, but I was aware of its location in the fabric the way you remain aware of certain things, regardless of how much effort goes into erasing them. In its place, I put a pair of deep wingback chairs in a brushed charcoal linen, the kind of chairs Helen had long wanted there, and had only held off on because Dorian had made the case that the sectional was more useful when people came to stay. I gave a weekend to painting the living room in the warm linen I had chosen. Careful, unhurried work, the type that holds your full attention and pays you back for the patience it demands. I was grateful for both. Each day I started early and went until the evening light gave out, and afterward I lowered myself into one of the new chairs with a glass of wine and studied the damp walls and felt with a clarity that built steadily that what I was doing was right and necessary. The second evening I opened the storage closet beneath the stairs, the one where Dorian had quietly moved Helen's photographs in his second year here, without a word to me, on the grounds that the look of the place needed updating. 11 photographs were in the box. I unwrapped every one and took most of an evening placing them where they belonged. The shot Philip had captured at the birthday gathering in 1996, Helen mid-laugh. Her head tipped back, nothing held in reserve, went up above the fireplace, back in the spot it had occupied for 15 years before Dorian decided it shouldn't. I set a nail into the freshly painted wall, hung the photograph, and stood back and looked at it for a good while. Better, I said out loud to her, to the room, to the air. I rang Philip that night. We were on the phone for 3 hours, the house, our growing up, a fishing trip the 2 of us had made with our father in 1970, that somehow hadn't come up in 40 years, the specific quality of relief that waits on the far side of a crisis once the shaking stops. Philip laughed at things I said that were only partly funny, and I laughed at things he said that genuinely were, and when we finally got off, it was past midnight, and I felt for the first time in longer than I could put a number to like the person I actually was. Not the self that had spent months managing a household built on deception. Not the self that had been going through the motions of an ordinary morning with a man who privately found him pathetic. The earlier one, the one who had stood in an unfurnished living room in 1997, holding a bottle of wine, and danced with his wife, because she said a house needed music and movement in it before it could truly become a home. That self had not gone anywhere. He had only been waiting for the noise to clear enough to find his way back. I picked up my drafting pencils the following Tuesday. 4 years had passed since I'd last touched them. They were in the top drawer of the study desk, rolled inside the same chamois cloth Helen had given me the day I left the firm, a small private occasion that had drawn more feeling out of me than I'd known how to explain then or since. I sat down and drew. Not a building, not anything with a client or a deadline behind it, just a structure, an exercise in proportion, and line the way a musician runs scales not to perform, but simply to keep the instrument in working order. My hand was hesitant at first, then steadier, and by the time the afternoon had wound down, it was moving with something that could almost cautiously, without overclaiming, be called fluency. I stayed at the desk until the daylight was gone. Then I put the pencils back, made dinner, and settled into the wingback chair with a glass of wine and looked at Helen's photograph above the fireplace. The house was quiet. The house was mine, and in some way, I couldn't have put cleanly into words, but felt without any doubt it was still hers as well. Perhaps more so now than it had managed to be in years. 3 months does not amount to much against most things that genuinely matter. It is not sufficient time to forget. It is not enough to finish healing. It does not resolve all the questions a crisis like this one leaves embedded in you, the quiet ones, the ones that come up at 4 o'clock in the morning or in the middle of an otherwise ordinary afternoon and ask you to account for what you failed to see and why you failed to see it, and what that reveals about the kind of man you have actually been. But 3 months is enough to begin sorting what is truly gone from what has survived. And in my experience, once that line is drawn clearly, it changes the quality of every morning that comes after. Renata called on a Tuesday in the first week of August and asked whether I'd like to meet for coffee. She named a place in Coronado, a small cafe on Cabrillo Memorial Drive she had been frequenting for 20 years. The sort of establishment that had outlasted 2 decades of shifting restaurant trends by declining to acknowledge them. Good coffee, dependable pastries, and window tables that looked out over a stretch of coastline that had not changed in any meaningful way since Helen and I had driven past it on the way home from the hospital, the afternoon we received her diagnosis, an association I had carried with that particular road ever since and had never spoken aloud to anyone. I got there first and claimed a table by the window. It was a clear morning, the kind of late summer clarity that arrives on the Southern California coast when the marine layer burns off early and the light comes down clean and hard off the water. I ordered coffee and sat watching a pair of pelicans trace long, unhurried loops across the surface of the bay, and for no reason I could name, I found myself thinking about the fishing trip Philip and I had taken with our father in 1970, the way our father had stood at the bow of the rented boat with his coffee and his silence entirely at ease in himself. And I thought that I had finally arrived at an understanding of that contentment I hadn't been able to reach when I was 14 years old, watching him from the stern. Renata arrived 7 minutes later, shaking her keys into her bag and dropping into the chair across from me with the purposeful ease of a woman who brought the same quality of attention to informal occasions as to any other kind. "You look better," she said before she had quite settled. "I feel better," I said, "most of the time." She ordered coffee, set her bag down, and trained on me the clear, patient attention she had been directing my way for 15 years, first as my attorney, and then slowly, without either of us making a formal declaration of it, as something that had come to resemble friendship. "The house?" she asked. "The house is good," I said. "Finished the living room, repainted the hallway last week. I've been thinking about the kitchen. Helen always wanted to change the countertops, and I talked her out of it because I thought the originals were perfectly fine, and I've decided I was wrong about that." Renata smiled. "What color?" "She wanted something warmer, a deep sage green," I said. "I found a sample card once in a drawer. She must have saved it for years without saying anything." I looked down at my coffee. "I'm going to use that color." "Good," Renata said, and she meant it in a way that had nothing to do with countertops. We finished our coffee in the easy quiet that settles between people who have traveled through something serious together and no longer feel any need to fill the silences with reassurances. Outside, the pelicans kept at their patient, unhurried work. A couple moved along the path below the window, the woman laughing at something the man had said, tilting briefly into his arm before pulling herself upright again. "There's something I need to tell you," Renata said, putting her cup down. Her tone hadn't changed dramatically, but it had shifted enough that I sat up slightly. "The DA's office reached out to me Friday afternoon. They've finished their preliminary review of the financial evidence that came out of the civil case." She paused. "They're moving forward." "Moving forward," I said. "Formally. 2 counts elder financial abuse under California Penal Code 368 and forgery under Penal Code 470, both felonies." She held my gaze steady, giving me the information the way she had always delivered hard information straight. No softening, no theater, on the premise that clarity is more respectful than cushioning. "If he's convicted on both counts, Dorian faces a potential sentence of up to 6 years. In practice, given that it's a first offense and the restitution order from the civil judgment is already on the books, his attorney will almost certainly pursue a plea. Most likely outcome: felony probation, mandatory repayment of the $340,000, and a criminal record going forward." I let that sit for a moment. 6 years or a felony record and the money repaid. In the 3 months since the verdict, I hadn't devoted much imagination to either of those outcomes. The more immediate task of reclaiming the house and the rhythm of daily life had occupied most of what I had. But hearing the figures stated plainly, I found my reaction was neither the quiet satisfaction I might once have expected, nor the grief I might have been braced for. It was something quieter and more tangled, a kind of weary acceptance, the sensation you have when a prolonged illness finally breaks. Not in triumph, but in the simple and enormous relief of knowing that the worst of it is definitively behind you. "Does Dorian know?" I asked. "His attorney was notified Friday," Renata said. "So yes, by now." I nodded. Outside, a third pelican had come to join the first pair, and all 3 were working in a loose formation, each adjusting its line in response to the others, with a coordination that looked easy and likely wasn't. I watched them for a moment. "Nadia?" I asked. "Nadia is doing well from what her attorney has passed along. The divorce should be finalized within the next 60 days. California's 6-month waiting period applies, but they filed early enough that the calendar cooperates. The forgery settlement is moving along. She's back in her classroom." Renata picked up her coffee. "She actually called me last week. She asked for your number. I told her I'd check with you first." "Give it to her," I said. Renata nodded, noted something on her phone, and set it face down on the table. "There's one more thing," she said. She reached into her bag and brought out a small envelope, cream-colored, and set it on the table between us. It was sealed. My name was written on the front in a handwriting I didn't place immediately. "What is this?" I asked. "Nadia left it with my receptionist yesterday morning," Renata said. "She asked that I give it to you in person." I looked at the envelope without touching it. It was the kind of object that shifts the character of a table simply by being placed on it, small plain, and somehow carrying more weight than anything its size had any right to carry. She also said, Renata added, and there was a carefulness in her voice now. The specific kind that belongs to someone who wants to deliver a message without losing a single word of it, that she wanted you to know she is going to be okay, and that she wanted you to hear it from her directly, not routed through a lawyer. I reached over and lifted the envelope from the table. Inside was a single card, plain white, no design on it. Nadia's handwriting was small and precise, the script of a person who had spent years printing on classroom whiteboards and had long since accepted legibility as part of the job. It read, Eugene, you didn't have to tell me the truth. You could have let me go on not knowing, and it would have been easier for you. The fact that you didn't is something I will carry for a long time. Helen raised a good man. I'm sorry it took me this long to see what her son became. Take care of yourself. Nadia. I read it through twice. Then I folded it carefully back along its original crease and returned it to the envelope. She's going to be all right, I said. She is. Renata agreed. I turned to the window, the coastline, the clear water, the pelicans still tracing their patient geometry above the surface, the late summer light spreading across everything with the particular generosity it has on mornings when you have somewhere worth going and enough time to get there. I thought about Helen's countertop sample card kept in a drawer for years without a word said. I thought about the drafting pencils rolled in their chamois cloth. I thought about Philip's voice on the phone after midnight, laughing about a fishing trip from 54 years ago. I thought about Florence. Helen had wanted to go since before I knew her. She had first mentioned it in the opening year of our marriage, standing in the kitchen of our first apartment in Escondido, reading a magazine piece about the Uffizi Gallery. Her index finger tracing the outline of a Botticelli, pointing at something she had already learned to love without having stood in front of it yet. We had planned the trip twice and called it off twice. Once because a project deadline got in the way. Once because Dorian had a health scare at 7 years old that turned out to be nothing but swallowed 3 weeks of our attention and energy regardless. After Helen's diagnosis, a journey of that scope was no longer on the table. And in the years following her death, I had not been able to picture making it alone. I was beginning to picture it now. "Ma Renata," I said. She raised her eyes from her coffee. "If I were to go abroad for an extended stretch, several weeks, possibly longer, is there anything still pending legally that would require me to stay?" She gave the question the same focused consideration she brought to everything practical. "The DA's proceedings don't need your testimony unless Dorian challenges the charges, and his attorney has signaled he's unlikely to do that. The civil judgments are settled. Nadia's case is moving on its own track." She held my gaze. "There's nothing keeping you here, Eugene, not legally." I lifted my coffee cup, set it back down, then took the envelope with Nadia's card and placed it in the inside pocket of my jacket, close enough that I could feel it if I pressed a hand to my own chest. "Stakachi, good," I said. "Good to know." Renata studied me for a beat with the look she wore when she was drawing a conclusion from available evidence. Then the professional composure gave way gradually to something warmer. "Are you going to tell me where you have in mind?" she asked. "Or is this where you make me wait until next time?" I smiled, the kind of smile that caught me slightly off guard, not assembled, not arranged to fit the moment, but simply present in the way things are when you've stopped working against yourself. "Next time," I said. She shook her head, lifted her cup, and laughed. We met the following afternoon at a coffee shop 4 blocks from Crestview Elementary. The kind of place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu carrying the particular low hum of a neighborhood cafe that has been exactly itself for long enough that the regulars no longer register the music. Nadia was already seated at a corner table when I came through the door, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea, hair pulled back, wearing a linen shirt the color of old paper. She looked, I thought, like a woman who had recently put down something very heavy and was still learning how her body moved without the weight of it. She got up when she saw me. We shook hands, and then after a brief hesitation from both sides, we embraced the slightly formal, entirely genuine hug of two people who have been through something together that doesn't map cleanly onto any existing category of relationship. We sat. I ordered coffee. For a moment, neither of us said anything, and the quiet between us was comfortable in the way that silences are comfortable between people who have stopped performing. "Yush, how are you?" I asked. Honestly. Nadia looked into her tea. Honestly, she said, I'm doing better than I thought I would be, which is its own strange sensation, like you've spent weeks bracing for a serious storm and then find yourself standing in ordinary rain. She looked up. I went back to the classroom on Monday. 28 kids, most of them not quite finished grieving their summer. All of them needing someone to actually look at them. She paused. It was exactly what I needed. It turns out 8-year-olds have very little tolerance for your private difficulties. I smiled. Helen used to say something similar about blueprints. Nadia's expression shifted, softened. How long were you married? 41 years, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Can I ask you something I've been holding on to since the day in your kitchen? Yes. Did you see it in him? When he first brought me home, did any part of you know? I took the question seriously, the way it deserved. I saw things I chose not to look at directly, I said. There's a distance between not seeing and deciding not to see, and I was guilty of the second for a long time. Helen was better at looking straight at things than I was. She had little patience for comfortable fictions. I paused. I think if she had encountered you under other circumstances, she would have told me something important well before I managed to work it out on my own. She would have liked you, Nadia, for the right reasons, not because you were Dorian's wife. The tears came quietly, without announcement, the way they arrive for someone who has held them at arm's length for several weeks and has finally reached a moment where holding is no longer required. Nadia pressed her lips together, gave one small nod, and reached for her tea. That's the kindest thing, she said, when she was able to. Thank you. We talked for another half hour about the forgery settlement, which was close to finalized, about the divorce, which would be concluded within the month, about her plans, which were tentative and carefully hopeful, in the way of someone who has learned the cost of overplanning. She was considering a summer program in Portland the following year, a writing curriculum for elementary students she had been drawn to for a long time and had never acted on because the moment was never right. The timing, she said, was beginning to look more right. When the conversation had reached its natural resting point, I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and placed an envelope on the table between us. Nadia looked at it the way people look at something they recognize before they've had a chance to open it. Eugene personal account, I said. Nothing tied to the trust, nothing connected to the proceedings. It is mine to give, and I am giving it. I kept my voice level the way Helen had always offered gifts, not as demonstrations of generosity, but as simple, completed decisions. You were deceived by someone in this family. You were placed at legal risk without your knowledge or your consent. And when the moment arrived, you walked into that courtroom and you told the truth, which is harder than it sounds, when the person you're telling the truth about is someone you once loved. I paused. Helen always believed that the people who love us well don't ask us to carry more than we can hold. She would have wanted you to have something that made beginning the next chapter a little easier. Nadia's jaw tightened. Her eyes were bright and very steady. I can't accept this. You can, I said. You already have, actually. I've decided, which means it's done. I said it the way she might tell one of her third graders, that the answer was already on the page, if they would only stop doubting it. Something in her expression shifted the resistance, not collapsing, but releasing not into defeat, but into something that looked far more like relief. She picked up the envelope. She held it in both hands for a moment, the way you hold something when you understand what it actually weighs. Thank you, she said, for the money and for everything before it. Take care of yourself, I told her, and come back and let me know how it turns out. She dried her eyes with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has learned to be seen without shame. Got to her feet, shook my hand firmly, and walked out through the cafe door and back into the ordinary Thursday afternoon that had been waiting patiently for her. I stayed at the table alone for a time after she was gone. Then I reached into my jacket pocket and withdrew the other thing I had been carrying, a single sheet of paper, folded once, printed that morning, at my kitchen desk. A flight itinerary. Florence, Italy. Departing San Diego International Airport on August 19th. One way. No return date. I had booked it the morning after the cafe with Renata at that same kitchen table where I had shared breakfast with my son for 2 years, and said nothing about what I knew. It had taken 11 minutes, a decision 40 years in the making, executed in 11 minutes, and that seemed exactly right to me. I held the itinerary in the afternoon light and studied it for a moment. Beyond the cafe window, La Jolla moved at its easy coastal rhythm, a woman walking a dog, a delivery truck sitting double-parked at the curb, 2 teenagers on skateboards cutting across the crosswalk without a glance either way. All of it ordinary, all of it continuous, all of it completely indifferent to the fact that the man at the corner table had just watched one door close and was holding a piece of paper that opened another. That evening, I stood at my bedroom window and looked out over the valley the way I had done thousands of times before. The lights of Pelican Bay stretched out in their quiet rows below the invisible Pacific, lying beyond them that particular quality of August dark along the Southern California coast that feels like something ending and something beginning at the very same moment. I thought about Helen standing at this same window the night we moved in, a little worn from the boxes and the long day, resting her head against my shoulder and saying she believed this was going to be a good house, the kind that holds people well. She had been right about that. It had held us. It had held us even in the stretches when we did not fully understand how badly we needed holding. I pressed my palm flat against the glass. The surface was cool and still. I'm going, I said quietly. I'm finally going, and I'm carrying everything you gave me with me. Out on the water, a single light moved slowly through the dark, a boat heading somewhere, patient and unhurried, entirely sure of where it was bound. Tomorrow I would begin. What I learned the hard way at 68 years old is that love without clarity is not kindness. It is permission. I gave my son permission for 8 years to take from me because I mistook keeping the peace for honoring the people I had lost. Do not make that mistake. Do not wait until someone has stripped everything away before you decide that you deserve protecting. From New York to California, from small towns to crowded cities, family betrayal does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, wearing the face of someone you raised, someone you trusted, someone you went on believing in long after the evidence said otherwise. This family story is not mine alone. I have come to believe that God places these moments in our lives not to break us, but to reveal exactly how much we are capable of surviving and rebuilding. My personal belief is simple. The people who truly love you will never ask you to make yourself smaller so they can inherit what you built. If someone is counting the days until you are gone, they were never really beside you to begin with. Family betrayal changes you, but it does not have to define you. This family story ends in Florence, and that is enough. That is where Eugene Calloway's story lands. Not in a courtroom victory, and not in the image of a man standing at a departure gate with a one-way ticket, but in the long, quiet years it took him to finally choose himself. I believe God does not waste the painful chapters. Every year, Eugene sat across that dinner table and said nothing every check he signed without asking why none of it was wasted. It became evidence. It became the foundation of something the people who were counting on his silence never anticipated: his clarity. What this cost him was time. What it gave him was the rest of his life on his own terms. If this Grandpa Stories has stayed with you, I hope you carry these things forward. First, love that asks you to be smaller is not love. It is a strategy. Name it for what it is. Second, keeping the peace is not the same as keeping your dignity. You are allowed to hold both. Third, when someone is counting the days until you are gone, they were never truly with you. Let them go before they take everything. Fourth, it is never too late to book the flight. Whatever Florence means to you, take it. This family revenge story ends with a man finally moving toward the life that was always waiting for him, and that is not a small thing. If any part of Eugene's journey has moved you, leave a thought in the comments below. Share this story with someone in your life who needs to be reminded that protecting yourself is not a betrayal, it is an act of love. And if you have not yet joined us here at Calm Family Revenge, now is a good time to do that. Thank you for sitting with this one all the way to the end. Take good care of yourself. I will see you in the next story.